Hello, I'm Eddie Hackstaff, and today I'll be presenting part one of my series on the Himalayan Expedition Mail. I'd like to give a shout out to the Nepal and Tibet Philatelic Studies Circle, which specializes in the philately of the Himalayan region. As for me, I've been a rock climber, a mountaineer, and a stamp collector for over half a century. In recent years, I've focused on marrying my passions, which has resulted in my specialization in the philatelic history of mountaineering expeditions. In this first part, we'll look at how the mail was moved to and from Mount Everest expeditions starting in 1921 and up to the years just prior to 1940, when expeditions stopped due to World War II. So let's get started. We'll start with a little geography. Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world and resides on the border of Nepal and the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China. It resides in the Himalaya mountain range, a vast mountain range in Asia extending 1,500 miles from Pakistan in the west to the eastern edge of India. The Himalaya cover most of Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan, and the southern edge of Tibet. It's the highest mountain range in the world with 10 of the world's 14 peaks that are over 8,000 meters in elevation. Mount Everest itself stands at 8,849 meters, or 29,031 feet. As I'll discuss today, the first expedition to Mount Everest started in 1921 with the British Reconnaissance Expedition. The 1924 expedition created one of the great mysteries of Mount Everest when George Mallory and Andrew Irving made a final summit attempt but never returned, sparking debate as to whether or not they reached the summit. Mallory's body was later found in 1999 on the north face, and it is assumed that they did not reach the summit. The ninth British expedition in 1953 finally culminated in the successful ascent that saw New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, a Nepalese Sherpa, reach the summit. It's interesting to note that with all the British expeditions to Mount Everest, the first Briton would not reach the summit until 1975. The Himalaya mountain chain has always held a mystique for climbing expeditions with deeply rooted personal interest, the appeal of extraordinary challenge, and national pride. As a result, it has always been very important to move mail quickly, not only to family and friends, but to the media, which was always seeking breaking news. It was also important to keep the major expedition sponsors aware of the progress. In addition to major sponsors, many expeditions took advantage of the opportunity to raise funds through minor donations by creating souvenir mail from the expedition. As mentioned earlier, this presentation focuses on the Mount Everest expedition mail. This is not to say there were no other expeditions going on in the Himalaya during this period. There were several: Italian and US to K2, Germany and Austria to Nanga Parbat, and France and Austria to the Gasherbroms, just to mention a few. I remind you that this is an ongoing study. I'll provide information based on my research that sometimes challenges previous understandings. We start with the 1921 British Mount Everest expedition. This was the first time Westerners approached Mount Everest. The expedition, and similarly the mail, would begin the trek in Darjeeling, India, walking over 300 miles one way through Sikkim and Tibet to the base camp on the Rongbuk Glacier, and in some cases to camps higher on the mountain. Most of this route is over 10,000 feet in elevation, with passes reaching heights above 15,000 feet. The 1904 Treaty of Lhasa established Indian postal agencies at 4 locations in Tibet, at Gyengtse, Gartok, Yatung, and Farijang. As luck would have it, 2 of these towns, Yatung and Farijang, were on the expedition route. The expedition made arrangements to use Farijang as their postal collection point and to use the local Tibetan officials to move the mail between base camp and Farijang. From Farijang, the Indian Postal Agency would use official runners to move the mail to India, where it joined the established international postal system. The reconnaissance expedition was considered an outstanding success. However, the mail suffered greatly from poor oversight by the Tibetan officials. There is mention of a few pieces of mail from this expedition in the collecting community, but at this time I've been unable to document any of these items. Similar to the 1921 expedition, the 1922 expedition used local Tibetan officials to move the mail. The expedition also hired specific locals that would carry the mail along the route to Farijang, Tibet. In Farijang, the mail was processed and handed to official runners to move the mail to India, where it joined the established international postal system. Neither the 1921 nor the 1922 expeditions applied any expedition markings, making it very difficult to identify the mail associated with these expeditions. There are a few documented examples of the mail from the 1922 expedition. This cover carried correspondence from the expedition doctor, Dr. Wakefield, to his father in England during the expedition. This second cover is a letter to Dr. Wakefield from his wife in England. However, since the team was already on the return journey when it reached Darjeeling, it was returned to England. In 1924, the British launched their third expedition to Mount Everest. It followed a similar route to the 1921 and 22 expeditions, but one of the major changes was in the mail. This expedition actively managed the mail, employing dedicated expedition porters to bypass the previously troublesome local officials. In addition, this expedition also incorporated the Yatung postal facility to supplement the previously used Farjong facility. For the outgoing mail, the postmaster would collect the mail, add stamps, and account for the costs. The costs would then be settled at the time of the expedition's departure. The 1924 expedition created the most identifiable expedition mail of any mountaineering expedition. They employed 4 specific expedition markings, an expedition label, and even an expedition postcard. Let's start with the label. This was the first ever expedition label. It was the idea of Captain John Knoll, the expedition photographer. What was the purpose? Was it used as a local stamp as suggested in previous documentation? Doubtful. Was it used to identify expedition mail? Possible, but the expedition used 4 very clear expedition markings that we'll discuss in a moment. Souvenirs? Most likely. It was very important for Captain Knoll to market the expedition for his upcoming documentary film. With few exceptions, the label was used on all 1924 correspondence. The label included an image from Mount Everest from the 1922 base camp on the Rongbuk Glacier, a border with the name of 3 countries, Sikkim, Tibet, and Nepal, and 1924, the year of the expedition. And in each corner, the Tibetan symbol called swastika, meaning prosperity and good luck. It should not be confused with the symbol used by the Nazi Party. The label itself is a fun collectible item. It comes in different shades and gums depending on the printing. It also includes various plate flaws, one being the geyser flaw that can clearly be seen on this block of 4. The first marking to be used by the expedition was the Tibet Marking. It was used on mail that originated within Tibet during the expedition, whether en route or while at base camp. This first cover shows a typical use of the marking on a registered cover sent by Major Bailey, who played a critical role in getting Tibetan permission for the expedition. This cover was sent to his mother in Edinburgh, Scotland through the Yatung Tibet Postal Collection Facility. The second example is a self-addressed postal card given to the expedition for mailing from Tibet as a souvenir. The expedition added the label and the marking before it was mailed through the Farjong Postal Collection Facility. My census has documented 55 examples of the use of the Tibet marking. The second expedition marking used was the main base camp marking. This is the rarest of the 1924 markings. It was used on mail being sent from the base camp at 17,000 feet and is always associated with an additional marking. This is usually the Tibet marking, but I found a few covers that include the advertising marking in black that we'll discuss in a moment. This cover was mailed to England from the expedition while at the base camp located on the Rongbuk Glacier. The expedition applied the label and tied it with the Tibet marking and placed the base camp marking on the reverse. It was carried by a mail runner to Yatung, Tibet, where the postage was added and it was forwarded on to its final destination. This second example is another self-addressed stamped postcard given to the expedition for mailing from Tibet as a souvenir. Again, the expedition added the label and the marking before it was mailed through the Yatung Postal Collection Facility. My census has documented only 12 examples of the use of the base camp marking. The third expedition marking was created for use with the film advertising postcard. The advertising postcard was again the idea of Knoll to advertise the expedition film. The postcard shows a scene similar to the expedition label of the 1922 base camp with Mount Everest in the background. It also includes a printed message from Knoll and the film release information. With very few exceptions, the cards received an expedition label that was tied with the red advertising marking as seen on this example. After the end of the expedition, Knoll mailed over 40,000 of the advertising cards. Some were mailed from Darjeeling, India, while the vast majority were mailed from Calcutta. These postcards are quite common. There's no indication that the majority of these cards were ever in Tibet, despite the statement on the card. There are a few exceptions to the use of the red advertising marking on the advertising postcard. I've identified 13 exceptions where the advertising postcards received a black advertising marking as shown on this card. Of those 13, 5 were actually mailed from within Tibet, while the remaining were mailed from Calcutta. There are also a few instances where the black marking and the label were applied to the postcard but were never mailed. These were possibly used as post-expedition souvenirs. Another exception is the use of violet ink for the advertising mark as seen on this cover. None of these passed through the mail and all have identical handwriting. I consider these a questionable use of the advertising marking. In 1924, a second expedition was launched known as the Tractor Expedition. It was launched to show that a mechanized group could reach Tibet. The expedition used a Citroën Model B2 tractor that had recently been successfully used to cross the Sahara Desert. The Republic of Mali issued a postage stamp with an image of the tractor that was used by the Tractor Expedition. The tractor followed a route similar to the climbing expedition. Due to multiple setbacks, including altitude sickness of the driver, the effort ended just short of the Tibet border at Natula. The Tractor Expedition used a fourth expedition marking. It was a violet marking that is usually found in very poor quality. Even though the expedition did not make it into Tibet, the mail was still forwarded to the expedition postal collection point at Yatung. This example shows a typical poor quality marking. In 1933, the British launched their fourth Mount Everest expedition. This expedition used multiple routes to and from base camp. The expedition used some routes to move equipment and other routes to move the lighter loads such as the mail. While in Gangtok, the expedition hired a postal liaison to ensure the smooth movement of the mail. This arrangement opened a new route between Gangtok and Kampadzong, skipping Yatung and Farijan. As a result, the postal collection point was moved to Gangtok. Mail runners were hired that were familiar with the route. They helped ensure timely movement of the mail. All the mail from the expedition received the new expedition marking. In addition, the expedition member initialed the envelope to add further control to the use of the expedition mail. The postcard shown here is from expedition member Tom Brocklebank while at Camp 3 to Anthony Blunt. As an aside, Blunt would later become a notorious Soviet spy, which is another fascinating story on its own. In 1935, the British once again launched an expedition to Mount Everest using the north route out of Gangtok. Previous philatelic documentation does not identify any 1935 expedition markings. However, this cover clearly shows a rectangular marking device existed, making this the only known copy. This cover was mailed from and to Darjeeling, so it is not known if the marking device was accidentally left behind in Darjeeling since no other covers are known. As a special note, a young 19-year-old Tenzing Norgay was hired for the first time on the 1935 Mount Everest expedition. Even though he was the least qualified of the final candidates, expedition records state that he was hired because of his great smile. Tenzing went on to great fame in the story of Mount Everest. In 1936, the British launched their sixth expedition to Mount Everest. Again, they followed the same route as the 1935 expedition, and once again, Gangtok was selected as the postal collection point. Similar to the 1935 marking, the expedition used a rectangular device with space for annotating the date or location. This cover was sent by Edmund Wigram, as initialed on the upper right. It was sent during the approach while in Shekardzong, Tibet. It was carried to Gangtok by the expedition mail runner, where it was stamped and forwarded on April 22nd. This is how the mail system was supposed to work. However, at some point early in the expedition, the sub-postmaster at Gangtok had different ideas about the mail. The expedition members became suspicious that the mail was not getting through since responses to questions and comments were not received in the incoming mail. During the return, the team reached Gangtok Sikkim and paid a visit to the post office. The team questioned the sub-postmaster and searched the office, where they discovered unforwarded letters. The regional postmaster general was informed and a postal investigation was initiated. During that investigation, several hundred letters were found in a nearby outhouse where the sub-postmaster was trying to destroy the evidence as seen with this cover. The sub-postmaster was subsequently convicted and sentenced to jail for the theft. This loss of letters and communication with home had to have resulted in great distress for families, friends, and sponsors. In the end, it was believed that over 500 letters were lost. Of that, 494 were recovered. These letters were each dated, numbered, and initialed by the new sub-postmaster. The back of each cover was also marked with the seal of Sikkim, and a label was attached explaining the delay before being forwarded without postage on to their final destination. Due to their soiled condition, few were saved. As a side note, I like to affectionately call this my poop cover, since it was found in an outhouse. In 1938, the British launched their last pre-World War II expedition to Mount Everest from the Tibetan side. Once again, the team followed the 1935 and 1936 route and used Gangtok as the postal collection point. Unlike the previous expeditions, this was a much smaller team that had hopes of moving much faster up the peak. Also, unlike the previous 4 expeditions, no expedition marking was used. There is only one documented cover from the expedition, so little is known about the mail arrangements. In the end, the team was defeated by weather conditions and the expedition retreated. The British would not return to the Chinese-Tibetan side again for another 44 years. After World War II, the Tibetan borders were closed to reduce Western influence on Tibetan culture. Then in 1950, the Communist Chinese invaded and Tibet fell under Chinese rule. After this, Everest expeditions from the north by anyone other than the Chinese and Russians were prohibited for many years. In a stroke of luck for mountaineers, there was a palace revolution in Nepal in 1950 which overthrew the ruling Rana family. As a result, Nepal was open to the west. Foreign mountaineering expeditions were allowed access to the southern side of the Himalaya for the first time. This launched an all-out effort by the British, Swiss, and Americans to finally scale the peak using the new approach through the Khumbu Glacier and icefall as seen on this strip of 3 stamps from Nepal. This would also see the return of Tenzing Norgay to the story and summit success in 1953. But this is a story for a future presentation on expedition mail from the Himalaya. This story is not complete. There is more research to be done to add more details to the movement of the mail from the Himalayan mountaineering expeditions. I encourage you to start your own collection of these fabulous items that help link us to the mountaineers of the past. One more thing before I go. Next time you're out on a hike or a climb, don't forget to send the mail. And please feel free to contact me to share any more information that you would like to add to the story. Stay tuned for my next 2 videos. Part 2, the flight over Mount Everest, and Part 3, the post-World War II era. In closing, I'd like to thank the following for their invaluable help. To Anthony Bart, who provided incredible access to his vast collection and information. I encourage you to visit his website at www.himalayana.com. To Bob Gould, the co-author of A Catalog of Himalayan Mountaineering Correspondence, who provided access to his vast amount of research for the book. To the Nepal and Tibet Philatelic Studies Circle that specializes in Himalayan philately. Their quarterly journal, Postal Himal, almost always has at least one article on Himalayan expedition correspondence. And to Sergio Lugo and Joe Lanat from the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library for their support and encouragement in the production of this presentation. Thank you for spending your time with me.